This chapter is about panning, or the stereo positioning of instruments that we presented in the previous chapter. To help with this, I will open our graphical representation of the orchestra, and using this graphic, I have panned the instruments in our template to represent this. We can have a look at this by opening the mixer. If we look here at the pan positioning of our instruments, we can see it relates closely to our graphic. Perhaps it is not exactly representative of how the orchestra is laid out, but it is close enough. One thing worth mentioning is that you do not have to stick to this panorama layout if you are trying to represent an orchestra. If you are trying to replicate the orchestra 100% and are basing your arrangement on a specific piece that you wish to replicate exactly, then it might be worth replicating the pan positions exactly. And likewise, it would probably be absurd to pan something like the violins completely to the right of the stereo image, certainly if you are trying to emulate the orchestra. However, quite often the virtual orchestra is being used in a very different context. In fact, trying to replicate the orchestra 100% is not really an achievable goal. We have to remember that each individual musician in an orchestra, or at least in a good orchestra, is going to be a great musician, and this combination of great musicians will be extremely hard to replicate by playing the parts yourself. So focusing too much on details, such as a 100% exact panning of specific instruments, is probably not worth it. Having said this, we do want the virtual orchestra to represent the real orchestra as closely as possible within reason. It is totally reasonable to expect to get close to the real orchestra, but 100% emulation shouldn't be the goal. What is important is that we use our virtual orchestra within, for example, a pop production or scoring for film, and in doing so, we achieve results that sound as natural and as real as possible. If we take our oboe as an example, we can see that it is panned slightly to the right of center. If, however, in my music the oboe is taking a more central role, I might wish to treat it more like a vocalist or a soloist. And in doing so, I would probably prefer for it to be panned more centrally. So although this may not be authentic in terms of how the oboist sits in the classical orchestra, it may suit my needs better for it to be panned in a central position. Another example might be that of a guitar being used in a production. If the guitar was panned similarly to the string section, then we would probably lose definition and clarity. So in this case, we may choose to pan the strings in a different way to the guitar in order to avoid the strings hiding the guitar itself. Of course, if you want an extremely wide stereo image, you could choose to pan the first violins hard to the left and the second violins to the right. But one thing to consider here is that most of the libraries will have sampled the instruments in stereo, and so they will already be placed in the stereo image. So if we take a violin patch and play it from our MIDI keyboard, it will already be positioned in the correct position vis-à-vis our seating plan. So in theory, we could keep these positions. But what will probably happen in reality is that if you add instruments such as percussion, vocals, guitars, or drums, etc., the organic or natural panning that the samples contain doesn't actually suit our production. So although it is a good thing for a library to have the natural panning, it may not suit our needs. One thing certain libraries do these days is to offer a variety of microphone positions. So for example, we could have close miking of each instrument, and then we could have a microphone picking up the sound that the conductor hears. And then we could have a third option of hearing the instruments as if we were seated in the audience. If we do have these options, then we can also balance the panning by adjusting the separate microphone sources. But one thing I would suggest when working with orchestral libraries is to treat them no differently to any other instrument within your arrangement, and to use the basic rules and tips that you know from working with instruments such as vocals, guitars, or drums. Some of these rules would be, for example, that extremely deep or low instruments are probably best panned more centrally, whereas higher instruments can be positioned in slightly wider stereo positions. Having said this, personal choice should still be at the top of your list. There is no single perfect choice, much like there is not just one specific seating plan for the orchestra. So feel free to position the instruments however you please. But obviously, the closer you are trying to replicate an authentic orchestra, the more you may refer to the orchestral seating plan. Another thing to consider when panning is that if we look at our pan slider here, we have 200 positions when you go from extreme left to extreme right. This is obviously an enormous amount of choice, and we should remember that basically as humans, when we listen to music, we probably only really listen to 5 stereo positions. Those would be completely right, middle right, central, middle left, and completely left. If we base our positionings around those 5 settings, we are already going to be quite close to a good panning balance. Then, if for example you had a vocalist in the center position, you could move the instrument slightly to the left or to the right of the vocalist to give such an important instrument some space. Once again though, if a specific situation occurs, for example that of a vocalist and a solo violin both competing for the same space within a mix, you could imagine that automating the pan position would be an option. But we would suggest that in this case, automating the volume would be a better option. Simply lowering the violin slightly when the vocalist is singing will leave space for the voice and sound more natural than instruments moving out of the way in the stereo image. One option, however, for changing the panning in the VSL instrument is the so-called power pan function. This is a more detailed way to pan instruments, and is available within the VSL instrument in the advanced options. Here you can adjust the pan position and the width of the panned instrument. If you are using a different library that doesn't have an option like this, you can, in Cubase for example, change the pan slider from a stereo balance panner to a stereo combined panner, which allows you to adjust not only the stereo position, but once again the width of a stereo track. If your DAW does not offer this option, I wouldn't worry about it too much. There is not such a huge difference between the two options in reality, but it is worth mentioning. So in summing up, we could say that the main points when panning your instruments are that personal taste is important, as is making sure your instruments fit the stereo image of the music you are working on.